Hi, welcome back to the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center's Out of the Hangar History video series, where we discuss historical episodes that have relevance to current issues today. I'm Kevin Rusnak, the Chief Historian for LCMC. Well, today's topic is the selection of the F-16 for production, which happened 50 years ago, just a couple of weeks ago. Well, this one is relevant in this era, in our current era of great power competition, where we're concerned about procuring systems in a rapid fashion, fielding new technologies, building up the defense industrial base, and those sorts of things. Well, if we look back to 50 years ago, we see that the Air Force was very much in the same sort of environment, this post-Vietnam environment where we're having to recapitalize our fleet using new technologies, getting new systems out to counter new threats, and doing so in a way that was affordable for them at the time. And the F-16 that we're still using today was very much a central component of that era in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And that's where our story begins. It's really the tail end of the Vietnam War, where we had several factors in that period really played into this idea of we need of uh, reconsidering how we built the United States Air Force's fighter fleet, what a fighter should look like, and what they should do. The first issue was really our experience, our actual combat experience with fighters. How are they performing in the air war? And initially, the answer was very poorly. We had large fighters that were developed to support the nuclear mission that were full of electronics that used radar guided missiles and so forth. But it turns out that these were relatively immature systems that did not perform as well as we hoped they would. And our large fighters actually often fell prey to smaller, lighter Soviet fighters that can turn inside of us and get in this sort of Top Gun kind of dogfighting that put our pilots at a disadvantage. Secondly, with that, we had our allies who were using fighters that we had sold to them in the 1950s and earlier in the 1960s, who were also looking for new technologies, new types of airplanes to modernize their fleets. Well, and the third component here was a name that's familiar to anybody who's really interested in Air Force history, and that's John Boyd. He's most famous for something called the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, and act, this kind of decision-making process. But for our purposes, he was really famous for his energy maneuverability theory. And this is John Boyd here that you see in the picture. And the graph shows this EM theory. He didn't originate that, but he was the strongest proponent of it. And that was this idea of breaking down the performance of airplanes into mathematics and graphically illustrating that. That way you could directly compare the performance of your aircraft, its advantages and its disadvantages against your opponent and determine under what flight conditions are you able to outperform your adversary. And so you could use this to decide, hey, how should I engage an enemy and defeat him more successfully? Well, his so-called fighter mafia were advocating for this approach that really determined that almost Soviet-style fighters, these smaller, lightweight, and powerful fighters with a minimal amount of equipment, a gun, and maybe a handful of missiles, were really the way to go for the Air Force of the future. Well, with those ideas kind of percolating in the late 1960s, you had introduced to the Department of Defense Deputy Secretary of Defense David Packard, one of the founders of the famous Hewlett Packard. He wanted to reform acquisitions to accelerate the acquisition process. That should sound familiar, but also make it cheaper and to introduce new technologies in a more affordable and effective manner than we had seen. And kind of in his previous era, we were deciding what programs to go ahead with, which contracts won based on paper designs. We would take very thick requests for proposal responses, compare them to each other, decide which one was the most likely to succeed, and then go ahead and proceed with that development. Well, this ended up with long development timelines, cost overruns, and all that sort of thing that David Packard hoped to avoid. Well, he latched on this idea of prototyping. Well, using a prototype wasn't anything new. There's the idea of fly before you buy, or having a fly off between competing designs, had been used for years, of course, and then later on comes back. But his idea for prototyping, I'll show you David Packard here. There's a good picture of him. His thought for prototyping was not for particular programs, but really almost as an R&D kind of effort. Like, hey, let's put together all of these concepts into prototypes that aren't necessarily tied to a specific acquisition program. And that way we can reduce risk by demonstrating these before we're actually having to spend them on a program of record. Well, so that idea was applied in part to the AX program, or Attack Experimental, that resulted in the A-10, and that's the A-10 you see on the left, and its competitor, the A-9. Those were actually flown against each other, but those, as I indicated, were actually tied to an acquisition program. But it really showed the value of having this kind of flying demonstration before actually buying the airplane. Well, his prototype idea coincided with the Air Force's standing up with a prototype program office here at Wright-Patt. And there, one of the programs they chose to pursue was called the Lightweight Fighter, or LWF. And this was exactly those ideas that John Boyd had advocated. Can we create a fighter that's completely divorced from something like the brand new F-15 that was coming online, where we're taking out all the expensive systems and really focusing on agility, the lightweight, and minimal cost? So they pursued that under David Packard's prototyping ideas. And they picked two different companies to do that. They sent them initially about $35 million, but the cost grew, of course. One was what you see here. This was Northrop's YF-17 design, based on something that they had come up with on their own to compete for these foreign military sales, these providing these airplanes to our allies. This was not necessarily a radical design, but it was very solid. It got the job done, as they say. But its main competitor in this program was the General Dynamics F-16. The YF-16 was the prototype you see here. It used a single engine versus the two engine. But interestingly, the high technology bit here was something called fly-by-wire, where you had a computerized flight control system where the pilot's control stick was no longer directly connected via wires and levers and pulleys and hydraulics to the flight control system, the actual elevators and ailerons and those kinds of things. But instead, it was connected to the flight control computer, which would tell the airplane itself how to move those surfaces to do what the pilot wanted. Well, this enabled great maneuverability and potentially greater reliability, but it was also unproven. And this is where the Lightweight Fighter flight test program could demonstrate that this was an effective idea. Well, as that's rolling along, the Air Force decides that yes, we do need actually to procure a new fighter to fill in the gap between the what they call the high F-15, this air superiority fighter with these advanced systems, to be we needed this counterpart to be what they call the low mix, or else this lightweight fighter, something inexpensive that could be deployed in very large numbers. And the Department of Defense wanted to do this. And it enabled that really by allowing the Air Force to add entirely new fighter wings to accommodate this, rather than replacing ones that would be filled otherwise by the F-15. So all these things kind of mixed together in 1974. You had the rollout and first flights of both the YF-16 and YF-17. They flew hundreds of hours during their flight tests out at Edwards. But by late 1974, the Air Force actually created the acquisition program, the Air Combat Fighter, and decided to base its acquisition decision, which one should we build, solely on the flight test data that they received through the Lightweight Fighter program. Meanwhile, our allies were also interested in buying their fighter, and so we got them to kind of get on board with that program. So this would be an international fighter program from the very beginning. Well, in January of 1975, the 13th January to be exact, the Air Force announces that this one airplane you see here, the YF-16, won that contest and would be procured both as the air combat fighter, but also as this international fighter with our European allies, our NATO allies at that time. Mainly, its advantages over the YF-17 was better agility, which I'll show you here. You can see that inner circle is how tight that could turn. Also better acceleration, turning. Most importantly, it was cheaper to operate and had a longer range because it has a 36% better fuel economy than the YF-17 did. And then, so shortly after that, February 1st, 1975, we stood up an F-16 program office to manage that program, and that program office still exists today. And for the YF-17, Northrop didn't feel too bad because they ended up selling that to the Navy in beefed up fashion as the F-18, which is still in production as well. All right, thank you very much for sticking with me through this video. Hope you enjoyed it and look forward to next time. Thank you.